COVID. I've now set up the recording, so we are good there. Jill is my co-host today. I'm going to make her a...
I got you.
You got it? Thank you, because I don't know what I'm doing. Hi, guys. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to get started. You guys see my screen?
We can. Looks good.
All right, good morning. Or good afternoon, actually. I mean, pretty much wherever you are in the world almost at this point. I'm in California, and we are presenting genealogy research and mental health. We are Our Genetic Legacy. Our Genetic Legacy is a nonprofit publishing house. We are the only publishing house that is using DNA to publish BIPOC authored and edited US history books. We publish the stories and legacies of everyday BIPOCs in historical context. As part of that mission, we also use DNA. And so we conduct these talks on Creative Mornings to share their platform, to share genealogy research tips, information, because we want everybody to be able to find their legacies, find their ancestry, in addition to the BIPOCs that we are focusing on. Today, I am your presenter. I am the CEO and founder of Our Genetic Legacy. And as I said, we are a nonprofit publishing house. Our focus is on integrating the history of America to include BIPOC stories beyond the trauma and enslavement stories that we are so familiar with. And today, because we are dealing with mental health and we understand that doing this type of research, it can take a mental toll. It is work, it is emotional work, it is mental work, it's physical work, it's a lot of work. And so we wanted to address that. And today we have Angel Hawk, who I have presented with once before, and we will let her introduce herself.
I just want to say thank you to Our Genetic Legacy for inviting me to be included in the presentation, being included in this space. So thank you, Shelley, for that. My name is Angel Hawk, and I will be talking to you today about mental health. I'll be also defining what trauma is and talking a little bit about generational trauma as well.
And then we want to also have a disclaimer, because we do not want this presentation to be misconstrued for medical advice. If you are experiencing severe symptoms, mental health crisis, we want to make sure that you know that you need to reach out to a professional who can give you individual counsel. We are not in that space in the terms of this presentation. So we just want to make that clear that a lot of the information that we'll be providing can give you hints and clues, but you need to make sure that you take care of your individual health with a professional who will deal with you individually. And we are also asking that you please ask questions in the chat. Alexis is monitoring the chat for questions. We will have question and answer periods at a break in between 3 different times in between each subject matter that we are presenting. So we definitely encourage questions, because that's why we're here. We're here to have a conversation. It's not just us sharing information. We want to also hear from you. All of my Creative Mornings talks for Our Genetic Legacy always come about as a result of the conversations that take place during each meeting. And so I'm trying to, it's such a wide field. So please ask questions that are relevant to the topics that are being presented, and we will answer them to the best of our ability. We will now start with Angel. We will turn it over to her to start over with what is mental health?
Okay, so in the beginning of the presentation, I'm going to define what mental health is. And so mental health is the state of well-being, the ability to be able to cope with everyday stressors, and the collective idea to be able to think, emote, and interact in moment-to-moment situations. So when you think of mental health, it's the ability to be able to cope with the normal stressors. So normal stressors in life can be the stressors of working at a job that could be fast-paced. It could be changes within your family in terms of schedule and routine. So there's a normal degree baseline of stress in life in general. And mental health includes the ability to be able to fluctuate between the good days, bad days, negative and positive emotions as you go throughout, and the ability to still be able to think cognitively, include emotional intelligence in there, and being able to emotionally stay engaged in your life moments as things tend to happen. There are clients that I work with that tend to have the misunderstanding that they're entitled to always having a good day and having zero stress in life, when that's just unrealistic and unpractical. So there are going to be good days that you have, but then how do we make sure that we give ourselves what we need for the negative emotions and the bad days and things like that? So being able to understand that life is definitely going to include positive moments as well as negative emotions, and the ability to be able to incorporate the changes of the negative and positive, and being able to have that flexibility to bounce back from both ends of the spectrum in terms of negative and positive emotions, good and bad days, and being able to cope with normal levels of stress. So going into the next slide, I'm going to be defining what trauma looks like. So what is trauma? Trauma is an emotional response to a phenomena or an event. It can include individual trauma, it can include cultural trauma, and historical trauma. Acute exposure to trauma can create a sense of disassociation and detachment. So going over the general definition of what trauma is, it's an emotional response to an event. And it can include different types of trauma. So again, individual trauma can include if you're losing a job, it can be if you're a victim of some level of physical or sexual abuse, sexual assault, if you're going through divorce. These are things that create an abnormal level of stress and that aren't typical in terms of life events, but they can happen. And when they happen exclusively to you. And that's what we talk about when we think about individual trauma. And then cultural trauma includes the individual in relation to a community. The example I would give for cultural trauma would be Jim Crow, civil rights, or slavery, in terms of something that can culturally link a group of people to a traumatic event. And then historical trauma connects the political landscape to something that affects a large scale of people. So again, going with the previous example of Jim Crow, African Americans, that's more of an historical trauma because it changes the political landscape of how African Americans are able to interact with people in their daily living space. And then when we talk about trauma, there are two types of trauma. One type is acute trauma, and the second type would be complex trauma. Acute trauma includes the traumatic event and the experiences of that traumatic event within a 30-day window or a 30-day period. Anything in response to that traumatic event in terms of its intense emotions and an abnormal response to stress and how it changes you as the individual and in your lifestyle, if that extends beyond the 30-day window, that would be considered complex trauma. So when we talk about acute exposure to trauma, it can create some symptoms, including disassociation and detachment. So what is disassociation? Disassociation, for example, can be someone being able to be in conversation, appear on the surface as though they're talking, relating, emotionally connecting, and maybe even showing some body language to show that they're engaged on the surface, but internally there can be gaps of memory, not connecting, almost like a daydream, to not really absorb the connection or the cognitive piece of what's happening. So it's the surface level of what they're doing, but internally it's a lot of disconnect, and it's the disassociation, almost like a daydream or almost like a mental flatline of not being present in that moment. But visually it appears as though you are. So that's one example of disassociation, how it could present on a lower scale. And then detachment refers to the almost like a numbing effect in reference to how you're not able to connect emotionally to what's happening to you. So an example of that could be if someone gives you some distressing news, if someone passes away, the detachment could be like a numbing effect to not be emotionally connected and present in that moment. So detachment more so refers to the emotional lack of connection. It can be a numbing effect, and disassociation refers to almost like on the surface being present, but internally it's almost like a daydream, gaps, and just non-presence of mind. Disassociation and detachment are symptoms that are associated with the response to a traumatic event. So if something traumatic is happening to you as an individual, for example, if you're experiencing levels of abuse, you might see some symptoms of disassociation, being able to easily detach yourself from conversations and might not even be listening, or being able to detach from the emotional response to what might be in front of you. All of those things are symptoms of a traumatic response. And so going into the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the definition of what generational trauma is. And so generational trauma is defined as the transference of emotional and physical pain from one person to another. The transgenerational transference can happen with familial, social, and cultural and genetic pieces as well. So when we talk about generational trauma, this would classify as a complex trauma because the traumatic event would have extended beyond the 30-day window, evidence to the generational piece from generation to generation, whether it's parent, child, grandchild, and moving on from there. And so the transference of the emotional and physical pain can be imprinted in our memory and our daily habits and how we attach to our understanding of processing difficult situations, how we process negative emotions, and moment to moment interactions. So if you're talking about a parent, that might create a family that normalizes not talking about sensitive topics, that could create intense emotions, that could foster crying, or being emotionally vulnerable, or talking about things that are just uncomfortable to talk about, whether it's past history of sexual abuse in the family that's not being talked about. And the family has created an emotional landscape to not engage in having topics like that. That's a normalized response, but that's based off of a traumatic response that could have happened within a generation or a generation prior to. So the example for that would be the sexual abuse could have occurred for the parent, and they might not want to talk about it. So the emotional landscape is to not talk about anything that requires vulnerability. And so by the time you're raising children, we're not talking about things that could create stress. We're not talking about ideas that I might not want to be here anymore, depression, loneliness, because there's already a platform internally accepted within the parents to say, we're not going to talk about any of those things because it doesn't move us forward in terms of our goals, our tasks, our routine. So we stray away from those things. And if we do bring those things up, it will be acceptable to look at that as a weakness or oversensitivity, and anything that doesn't progress us to view our perspective as strong. And so what's happening is it normalizes an environment where we're not ever creating spaces to engage in vulnerability, to talk about difficult traumatic situations, whether it's experienced with the parent's history or the children's history. And all of those things have an emotional imprint on generations after the parent, child, and grandchild. So that can be an example of the transference of withholding information and not talking about abuse that could occur, to also inflict generational trauma through normalizing not talking about sensitive topics such as that. So that's just one example of generational trauma and how it could play out with generation to generation. And going to the next slide, if you have any questions in terms of how to understand generational trauma, how that shows up for people of color, specifically African Americans, and what that looks like currently, if you have any questions about understanding trauma in reference to, are you having traumatic responses in your daily routine, but you're not aware? There could be some detachment going on, and you want to figure out if that applies to you or if it doesn't. If you have any questions that deal with detachment, disassociation, understanding trauma, what that looks like, and what are the lasting effects of that, and what are the implications of not talking about traumatic responses, and how that how that affects relationships that we want to keep close. Definitely ask questions in the chat, and also feel free to reach out to me offline after the presentation as well.
Everybody take a deep breath. It's a lot of information to process. We're heading into the research and genealogy aspect of that. And it's the reason for this conversation is because sometimes the way that it's marketed and advertised is that genealogy is, a hobby. It's something that you do for fun, but oftentimes a large proportion of people, they have to deal with, some real hard truths in finding that genealogy. And so one of our questions that we have is, where does collective trauma fit in? Thomas Hubel refers to collective trauma for genocide, slavery, etc. That's for you, Angel. Did you?
So the question is, how does collective trauma fit in?
Yes, I'll read it again. Where does collective trauma fit in? Thomas Hubel refers to collective trauma for genocide, slavery, etc.
So the traumatic response to a cultural trauma, it can show up in different ways. It could show up just in the way that it's recorded and being taught to us in an educational setting. It could show up with the traumatic response of detachment and distance, with not associating yourself with what you perceive a historical event to be in relation to you. So for a hypothetical example, a traumatic response could be if African American is unwilling to say, okay, well, slavery happened, but that has nothing to do with me now. That doesn't speak to my current experience. And so I don't acknowledge in the same way that other Black people might acknowledge that. That can also be reviewed as a trauma response if your association with slavery has been taught as a negative thing, a demeaning thing. You're equated, who you are is always equated to servitude and nothing else in relation to that, and who you are is only in relation to how the traumatic violence was inflicted upon these Black people. So historical trauma definitely connects to the traumatic response of how we understand history, how it's written, how it's recorded, how it's taught to us, and then our attachment and to those ideas and how we choose to detach from those things depending on how uncomfortable it makes us feel.
So I guess kind of like to maybe further expand upon that, when you're talking about, like when we're talking about it in reference to doing the research, you're talking about historical trauma. When you talk about trauma, is it its own thing? I don't know if that makes sense. Where, how you deal with it is one thing, but what it is, once you define it, is in some sense, it's definable, where for each person, how you deal with that might be different. Am I making sense?
Yeah, so is trauma its own package that's a little bit separate from something else that you can get in therapy or in mental health services. It is, because depending on your connection with trauma, you have to be very careful with how you unpack that box, because it could very well make the situation worse, and you could see a person that could have a more stabilized baseline of operating on a daily basis. For example, if someone in my field of social work, you see sometimes children that are victims of sexual assault, sexual abuse, that have gone through outpatient therapy and have made some strides, but they have to be with a therapist that's paired with specializing in trauma and who's also paired with sexual assault and sexual abuse specifically, because if not, it could undo the progression of that patient just by inappropriate phrases of just everything will be okay. And you might say that to a stranger, but saying that to someone who has endured sexual abuse and has made progress, that could set them back for different reasons depending on the patient. So trauma is its own separate space, only because depending on the context, depending on the client, it requires a different type of care that can't just be thrown in with somebody who struggles with nervousness, so that has to be worked on. But the trauma in terms of cultural trauma is not going to be worked with and mapped out in terms of goal setting the same way that you would with somebody that has individual trauma, if that makes sense. So if you're talking about a trauma with some cultural connection, some historical connection, mapping out goals and objectives to accomplish in a community level to address the traumatic response that a community is experiencing is not going to look the same as someone who might have, who's coping with divorce and struggling with the transition of how their family is looked, how the landscape of their family is different. So trauma is not going to have the level of care as opposed to historical or cultural trauma.
Very good. We'll now move on from this question and answer period to preparing for research. So we have, just in the first, 20 minutes, we have already stepped into a minefield of information, emotions, that is very individualized. But one of the things that we can do in terms of preparing for this type of research is breathing. I don't know how many of you have had experiences to where it's just like, take a deep breath. Like it's a real thing. Like, it seems like one of those colloquial terms but it really is scientifically proven that it calms the nerves. It helps people to be able to deal with stress. That breathing correctly means supplying your bodies with the right amount of oxygen and replenishing the brain and other vital organs with essential nutrients. So we have a breathing exercises that we're all going to do together. You breathe in through your nose for a count of 4, feeling it in your body. Like this is a full body breath where you are supplying oxygen to your entire body. You then are going to hold that breath for a count of 7. When you release that air, it's going to be a slow count of 8. If you can, put your tongue behind your bottom teeth and make a whooshing sound as you exhale. It's like you are releasing the air. So we're going to do all this together. Everybody breathe in. Breathe out. Studies have shown that doing that twice a day for 4 to 6 weeks will make a difference in your overall ability to handle stress. We know that research can be stressful, life can be stressful. There's a lot of stressors in our life. So this is a universal freebie in terms of the importance of breathing in order to give you that time, give that mental break, give you that physical break, give that air to your body to be able to process, because stress is a fight or flight. Angel?
And then also I wanted to include this exercise is really important because, we don't think to do this in moments of stress, crisis, trauma, when things don't go our way, when we're angry or frustrated. I have experience doing group counseling with substance abuse patients that were also psychotic, with adults. And so you saw adults bicker back and forth and get upset all the time. But when we're inside the session, they're, oh yeah, we need to deep breathe. But when you're upset and you want to argue with somebody, you're not doing any deep breathing. And so the breath is really important because when we're upset, we do a lot of chest breathing, shallow breathing. And so exercises like this are really important because it includes belly breathing to incorporate that through the nose, out the mouth, and just the repetition of that to physically slow your body down, slow your brain down, slow your thoughts down, which is really important. And what I typically suggest to my clients is that practice breathing exercises when nothing is wrong and make that into a routine. So more than likely when you're upset and when you become irritable, however it might change for you, you could tap into using the breathing exercises because you're practicing it when nothing's wrong. Now something's wrong, and then you can practice something that you already know to do. So the breath is important for the repetition to slow you down, but it also forces you to physically pause, think, and then decide what the next step is going to be. And what's important is to slow down your thoughts too. typically when you're upset or when you have a mood shift, you're going to have several thoughts at the same time, or depending on the individual, you might not have any thoughts. You know, it might become like a blur or a blank. And that's a red flag. And so if that's you, the breath is really important because you want to re-engage your physical senses to make sure you're connecting who you are to physically ground through breath, to kind of turn on your thoughts again, think, process, what do I want to do? Do I need to engage? Do I need to pause? Do I need to go away for a second and then come back? And so all of these things are really important. So my suggestion is to practice breathing exercises when you're in an okay state. So you can more than likely pull on the breathing exercises when things aren't going so great, when you notice the frustration and irritability coming up.
I think that's a very important point, is to normalize the breathing aspect so that it's something that you instinctually default to when you have moments of crisis. So thank you, Angel, for further adding emphasis to the importance of, something that seems so simple, requires no equipment, no extra. It's just taking the time, taking a moment, being intentional and breathing, and taking that time to slow your brain and get your thoughts together. So the more you can make that part of your daily practice, overall, I believe that you will do better. Now, when we're talking about research, we're talking about objectiveness versus humanity. Oftentimes when we are researching with an objective. I've taught other Creative Mornings talks where I say, have a research plan, know what your question is, what your the information is that you're trying to get to. The problem with that is that, or not the problem, but just one of the issues of it is that genealogy is a collaborative sport. It requires you to interact with others because you guys are each filling in gaps for each other. The problem with that then becomes not everybody tests for the same reason. Some people just want to go with the marketing and they realize like, oh, I spit in the tube, I got my results back. I thought I was going to open an email and it was going to tell me who I was, and I was done. Not everybody is prepared for the long haul search and the actual reality of genealogy, to where, yeah, there's some surface information that is interesting and fun, but in terms of the real research, it takes work. And so when we are oftentimes reaching out to matches that haven't logged in for 3 to 11 months, and mind you, this might be a first cousin match. This could be the person. This is the breakthrough to get you to that next generational level. And you're just like, they're ignoring me. Like, you take everything personal. Like it's me, like they're ignoring me. They're not responding to me. And that's where the humanity comes in, where I want to remind people it's not always about you. You know what I mean? Like everybody has their own reasons for doing what they're doing. And just because it doesn't align with what you want them to do, and this could be like your breakthrough moment, you have to redirect that energy into continuing the research in other ways. And one of the things that I have learned over time is that the more you give into doing the research, not everybody, everybody has their own belief systems, but I believe that my ancestors speak to me. They give me information. When the timing is right, like things show up that I wasn't looking for, that give me breakthroughs that I never imagined I could make, that, 15 years of research, like in 2 hours, I've suddenly solved this mystery that I've been searching for. So we just want to make sure part of the frustration and in dealing with, research and mental health is the fact that you have to be cognizant and you have to offer the same grace, extend the same grace to others that you want extended to you. And at times there are going to be moments in research that are extremely frustrating. And it's those times where you just need to breathe. Another issue with doing research is do no harm. Not everybody wants to know, and that's their right. We have a saying where it's, DNA doesn't lie, people lie. We don't know why people, do the things that they do, but we also are not always in a position to be responsible or to be helpful in terms or supportive in them going through their struggles. So if they shut down, you have to respect them in that space, allow them to have that space and figure out ways around that to do the research that you need to do. They don't owe you anything. And sometimes that's hard to deal with because you're just trying to figure out who you are. And especially when you're dealing with cases of unknown parentage or misattributed parentage, because you just want to know who you are. You're so intent on looking for yourself in this research, finding out who you are, that when you hit those, those blocks, those road, those where you have people who just aren't interested. They're cool with, how their life is, and they just don't want to expand it. I mean, I myself, I tell people open enrollment is over, like open enrollment is closed. So like I am totally free with information, but in terms of expanding that to actual physical, real life relationships, it's a case by case, but my general rule is that, I'm willing to share information. That is what my priority is. But like I say, everybody has a different way of approaching it, and we just have to respect that, even when it does not align with our mission. And then, trust the ancestors, keep doing the work. It might take years. Like I say, it took me 15 years. Just a month ago, I broke through a brick wall that I didn't think was humanly possible. So it does happen in due time. It's just, you have to give that space and give that grace. And oftentimes when you give that grace to others, they'll come back to you later. Like if you come back with a contentious dialogue on ancestry because somebody's not matching you or not responding to you the way that you want them to. If you come back with a negative, feedback, odds are they're never going to help you. But if you extend some grace and say, hey, and just, hey, periodically, it could be Easter, it could be Mother's Day, it could be like, oh, it's a bright sunny day. Start sending random messages periodically, don't be stalkerish with it, but, sending just random, and then they'll be like, what, hold on, like, I want to help this person. Let me see, like, the empathy will kick in. So it's just being mindful. And that's the same thing with the breathing, the same things with what Angel's talking about is being mindful. And sometimes when you're in heat of the moment, that can become difficult. So if you start to be able to practice those things in your day-to-day life, it extends to the research. Like you oftentimes don't realize how broad doing this research can impact your life. Like it's who you are, your genealogy, your legacy, your biology, it's everything that you are. So
also with that, Shelley, I just wanted to chime in reference to when you were talking about the do no harm, and if someone is on the other end as the consumer and then there's a breakthrough and they might be shutting down a little bit. That's why, going back to the slides where I was talking about the disassociation and attachment is really important, because if you're someone who is a consultant and doing the research, and you're intuitive enough to know or to notice when someone is shutting down, is also important to know the limitation of each lane, the consumer in relation to the person providing the service. So being able to pick up on the cues to know that, what is a breakthrough, they might be having a negative response to that. The limitation is, I'm not a therapist, I didn't go to school for this, but to know that they're struggling and having a hard time, and being able to pause in that moment to not make it worse so that the patient doesn't, emotionally dysregulate and spin out of control, to be able to just kind of pause for a moment and even just let them know, like, are you okay? You seem like you're a little bit upset. Did you want to stop for a second? Or let me know if you want to continue. Those different cues are important, because if you're in a field where objectiveness is needed in order to get the task across the deadline, it also provides a convenient space for some detachment. And that might not be as helpful for the person sitting across from you, if what could be a breakthrough for them could also be a regression in some negative emotions to kind of spiral out. Again, the researcher isn't responsible for that, but being in tune to just the emotional cues, how the room might feel a little bit more stiff, or it might be difficult to talk in those moments, are all important. And then to just be transparent, and all of those things are important in terms of rapport building, relationship building, and then also just knowing, like, I understand and I see where you are, and I wish I could help you with that. Here's what works for me. Here's how I can relate to you. Here's some people that you might want to consider talking to in terms of support groups that I could give you and link you up with resources. And we could stop here. Let me know if you want to continue, but here's the limitation of what I can do to be able to say, this is the realm of why we're here. These are the services I can provide as a researcher. I see that you could be having a hard time. Um, and I understand to a certain degree, and I want to be able to help. Let's stop right here. You tell me what you would like to do. And all of those components are just pieces to encourage connection. And when Shelley was talking about grace, grace, compassion, forgiveness, all of those things foster connection, rapport building, and closeness. And sometimes, depending on the breakthrough and depending on what's being talked about, the person on the other end might want detachment and could act out negatively in response to that. Again, it's not your responsibility to walk them through that. And that's why you want to be able to connect them to resources if they're open to it, or being able to say, we can stop, and you let me know when you want to pick back up and finish through. But here's the limitation of what I can do. So I say that to say, understanding the limitations of the researcher versus the consumer are also really important. And then also being able to intuitively pick up on the red flags as well. If you notice that someone could be shutting down and not push beyond that, but then encouraging limited levels of pause, silence, and then checking in and just encouraging them to decide how they want to take the step forward, and not pushing them to go beyond what they're able to emotionally be able to do.
Thank you. So once again, continually, whenever we're dealing with the whole person, it's a lot to unpack. And you know that in your own head. So at all times, think that just if you have a million thoughts in your head, the other person you're speaking to has a million thoughts too. You have different experiences, different reactions, different ways that you process and deal with. And it's just the reality of dealing with other human beings. And so you have to be mindful of that when you're just so focused on like the research, the answer. I want to get to the answer. Life happens, and in between the sentences. That being said, when you find your eureka information, somebody who has a public tree on Ancestry that links you to, the trifecta over the brick wall, screenshot all of that information before you make contact. As a researcher, that is the best advice I can give you, because we do have control over our information. And so you could reach out to someone who, doesn't want to deal with the information, who at one point, freely shared it, but when it got to be contentious or, they got uncomfortable, they will block you. They will make their tree private. There are things that happen. And so these are ways to be able to figure out how to continue your research without having to interact with this individual, should they need that space to, disconnect from you, but it doesn't stop you from continuing on your search. One of the other things you can do with that is, shared matches with that person. If, they have that tree, you want to start marking those. There are things you can do from a research standpoint to be able to continue doing the work without making it all contingent upon this person needs to talk to me. Or if they, privatize their information, now you're back to square one. So this is just research 101. From the things that you need to do is to be able to screenshot that information, get what you can from it in order to continue in the event that they choose to disconnect, and be able to respect that without having any negative feelings, which leads us to the be patient. Research, there's, with every generation, the number of grandparents doubles. So it gets high very quick. You go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 without like doing a whole lot of work in terms of, determining your family tree. And every branch will have its own highs and lows, its own path, to be unveiled. And you just have to take your time. This is not, a quick and easy pay for your test, open the email, and suddenly, ta-da, you know who you are. And so I think a lot of that too becomes some of the frustration where that's what people are signing up for and then realizing that they're not getting it. And so that's that hole of people that don't interact or collaborate with other matches because they're so disappointed that this is what, I was paying for. I didn't get what I wanted. And I don't understand like all this work that I have to do to make that happen. It's not what I signed up for. And so those matches can still be used. That information is still important. It can still further your research without ever having actual conversation with that person. You can do that by grouping the shared matches, figuring out what side that's on. The through lines on Ancestry is based on the trees of people. So if a tree is wrong for somebody's DNA, then the through lines is going to be wrong as well. But what it will give you is that line of descent. So even with a name is privatized, or if a name is wrong, you can look at the number of CMs, which is centimorgans, which is how DNA chromosomes are measured. The greater the CMs, the closer the relationship. So it'll give you some of those probable relationships where, you can see that it's probably 3 generations down. So you don't have to put the name there, but you can put a blank box. Unknown XYZ, unknown, grandparent of XYZ, so that you know what boxes you need to fill in to create that line of descent, to know what that probable relationship. DNA Painter is another website that does that. It's a little more intricate, but if you can, you are able to put in the number of CMs of the matches, and if you can compare that with somebody else's, and you put in you can get the probable relationships based on the matches between 2 people, how they match the same set of people. I've been able to do that a few times to where the probability was 100%, like this is the relationship. So that I can build a tree off of that, even though I don't have the specific names. I know that I need to figure out who the father, grandfather, great grandfather is, because our connection is that next level. And, compare it to other matches in order to, start filling in, to be able to still continue to build trees while you're still filling in that information. These are ways around that. We now have time for questions. I know we've given a lot of information, and it appears that a lot of people are processing, so there aren't a lot of questions, which I don't know if that's good or bad, but we're going to keep it moving because we're actually down to 15 minutes. I think that's going to take the rest of our time. So it actually kind of works out. Research, unexpected findings. We've kind of, mentioned this in terms of how to manage DNA surprises. From a professional versus an individual standpoint, if you DNA test and you get your results, like, your cousins have been talking about it and you're all excited and you get your results and you don't see any of their names. You're like, what the hell? Who am I? Like, it can change your life on any day of the week, any age, any ethnicity. It's across the board. I see it every day. What do you do? Or as a professional, you have a client that is, has a tree and has a very solid, seemingly understanding of who their, seemingly biological family is. You get the results, you're looking at it and you're like, no, that's, how do we have this conversation? One of the things I know from a genealogical standpoint, what we always encourage people to do, and even though as a genealogist, sometimes I skip steps because I get overly comfortable and think I know what I'm doing. And then I get a surprise like that. That's why I tell people, always ask someone who you are asking to test, do they want to know? Whatever you find out, give them that option before the information even becomes an issue. If they say no, respect that. If they say yes, it still requires a level of care and respect, but at least, you have an idea where if you don't ask and you get the information, you're suddenly stuck in this conundrum of, do I tell them or do I not? What do I do? What do I do with this information? Because I can, see clearly that this is not the case. We're going to ask for Angel. From a mental health standpoint, the spiral that can initiate, what would you suggest from a individual and a professional standpoint?
So if you notice, and you're more so speaking to like when it emotionally gets out of control in reference to, they say they want to know, you tell them information, and then it still goes left.
It's both. It could be that, you never expected, like you thought, they thought they're comfortable and knew who their parents are. You testing them based on that confidence. The results come back. It's not that. So, and you didn't have that conversation beforehand. What would you recommend?
And so the conversation beforehand piece would be really important in my mind, because that goes back to the do no harm aspect. If you're doing research with a company that's for profit, and then there are certain disclosures that have to be signed off on, that's the perspective of how the company uses harm in relation to how the consumer might perceive harm at any different time within the company. So again, it makes me think about clarifying the level of what harm could be perceived as, and how that could show up as research continues, and then stopping at different points to even check in, like you were saying. Is it something you want to know? They say yes to it. You give them the information, and then they still become emotionally dysregulated in terms of, their emotions get out of control, yelling, screaming, however that might play out. And so if that happens, the limitation, of course, depending on how negative the situation is, if you're the researcher giving that information, you want to just go back to the different points in time where in the beginning we already discussed what this is and what our relationship is in terms of research, the findings, how we can go into it, we can start. And then I asked you at this point, just going through the benchmarks of how things were addressed and their level of participation in terms of their yes and no decisions, reminding them in reference to the things that they wanted, what the expectations are, where the limitations are. And then if they're still behaving in a way that's just not okay, not being able to sit through that and take that, no, that's not okay. My limitation is the way it's stated it was beginning of our relationship. Now, if you're realizing that it's making you upset and frustrated, and you're looking to me to figure out how I can assist you with that, then being able to just preliminary connect to this, yeah, this is frustrating. This is a big step. This can be life shattering. And this is difficult. But then as a person listening and creating connection and vulnerability space, there has to be a timeline. So you shouldn't be walking anyone through their emotional journey in that process, noticing it, providing maybe like 2 minutes of just connecting with them in terms of how difficult this can be, and then just putting some referrals and resources in their hand to follow up for additional support outside of that research relationship. Because if the relationship is just consistent on the transaction of information that they want to know, you can't therefore walk them through that emotional journey, because that's another service outside of them. But as a person to person relationship, you want to be able to just to put that to the side and say, yeah, this is one of the things that is difficult to hear, and I'm sorry that this is uncomfortable for you right now, and I notice how uncomfortable it is for you right now. This is how it would make me feel. This is how I view it from your shoes. And then being able to stop right there, because that's where the limitation is, and then saying, hey, here's some support groups that I notice in the area that could be helpful for people that are processing through grief. And in that case, it could be just the grief of information and the traumatic response to knowing that your parents aren't who they say they are. Here's some referral sources of people that you can talk to that are mental health therapists to be able to walk you through understanding how to cope with that in your day-to-day lifestyle and interacting with these people, and how to interpret and the information that's in front of you. So again, understanding the limitations, reviewing with them at each step of how they were included in the decision-making process. And if they're still in a space of being emotionally sensitive to whatever that information is, being able to try to connect on a time sensitive basis. It shouldn't be going beyond 3 minutes at that point, and then being able to put some resources in their hand and then encourage them to continue to get the care they need outside of the research relationship.
And speaking of that, is a good segue into, so our next question is probably the most loaded situation that the majority of people will have to deal with at one point. I'm going to present the question, then I'm going to give you some more information, and then we're going to talk about the question because we are coming up on the end of our time together, and I want to make sure that we get to the end, but I also want to make sure that give people an opportunity to process and be able to ask questions. We have a limited amount of time. So the next, hold on. It's going so well. Managing historical traumas. We've talked a lot about traumas in general. We're talking about historical traumas when we're talking about doing research, strategies for neutralizing intense emotions. And then we get to the elephant in the room in the majority of research when we are dealing with even though we are moving into a non-binary society, it has been typically Black and white, historically speaking. And so when we're doing genealogy and we're doing genealogy research, we have to deal with the elephant in the room of enslavement. So as African Americans, people of color, you find proof that your ancestors in slavery as a biological relative. It's a lot of information to unpack. When I say it's a lot, I know it's a lot because I've recently, as a professional researcher, have had my suitcase loaded up. I've been able to DNA prove some things where I know that this is what I've been looking for 15, 20 years. And then you find it and it's not the eureka moment that you thought it was going to be. It's not the like, ta-da, yes, I found it. And now it's like really dealing with the reality of it, outside of the abstract. The same thing with, white Americans, where you talk about, you find proof that your ancestor wasn't in slavery and DNA cousins are contacting you. That's another impetus for the screenshot. That's where it started from, was when, even before the DNA testing, just contacting white cousins who shared information on their tree before the DNA testing became so prevalent. It was a common thing for suddenly that information just disappeared. You no longer had access to that tree, even if it was wrong. Like you don't even know, because you don't have the DNA, but just based on from research perspective, not everybody is researching for the same reasons. Not everybody is looking for the same information, but particularly for African Americans and some other people of color populations where that's an issue, it requires that collaboration between your European American cousins. And often it's uncomfortable. I get it. It's uncomfortable on both sides. So it's a two-way street. It's like, as much as you're engulfed in, do I apologize for my ancestors? Like, I don't feel that way, and feeling the need to validate and prove that that's not who you are and that was then, this is now. Or as an African American, not knowing, like, do I embrace these people? Do I cuss them out? Like, I'm angry, but I'm happy, but it's just a constant, it's a shit show of emotions that you're trying to, process and deal with. And it's a case by case basis. So I want you guys to think about that. I see another question has come up. Ask questions. I'm going to give you some brief follow-up. Oh, wow. I don't even think we have time to answer the questions. Damn, I'm sorry. Here's how to reach Angel. There's her Facebook, her Instagram, her email. I will also be sharing this video on YouTube. So here we go with our genetic legacy, our Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. I don't tweet a lot. I don't know why. I just have an issue I'm still overcoming, but and also our website. So these are ways that you can keep in touch. I'm going to ask our last question really quickly. Let's see if we can answer it quick. Do the hosts have any advice for people who know that their lineage includes terrible ancestors? Oh God, I feel like we answered this. Okay, I'm curious about my family tree, which I know includes someone who has recently roasted on an episode of a BBC history podcast, but I'm not sure I have the stomach to really see what my ancestor and his descendants did. It felt really good to hear my famous ancestor get roasted by the BBC, but I know that I'm related to people who were awful. Just to keep it, because we are almost out of time, to say the reality is that we all have tendencies, capabilities, things that, aren't our proudest moments. And obviously this is a little different because it sounds like it's has far greater impact, but that doesn't have to be who you are. And so if you are transparent and authentic in who you are, one of the things that I have noticed across the board is it translates. People pick up on energies and vibes, and it's underestimated, I think, in a lot of spaces. But if you come with a sincere heart and you truly do the work, don't expect for anybody else to do the work for you. Actively participate in doing that research and being open to, wow, like you can be just as disgusted with your ancestors' behavior as those who were affected by it. It doesn't have to be an isolated event. It's something that you can share in, but you can also find the good of it, because at the end of the day, if they didn't exist, if they didn't do what they did, good, bad, or otherwise, you wouldn't exist. And so we have choices that we get to make in terms of how we choose to interpret the information, whether we deal with it as a fact or as a condemnation of the entire legacy. Like, you can be the change agent to do something different, but also to be able to give a gift to those descendants who were mistreated by giving them the information, giving them that knowledge, because that is one of our biggest obstacles that we don't have control over, because the records don't exist. So if you have access to records and information that will expand the information, that is a way that you can, pay a form of reparations. And that's, I know, a loaded word, but for lack of a better term in this moment, I will use it. But it's something that you can do to counteract some of the negativity of the previous generations. And it is hard conversations. It is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Like, if it were light and fluffy, then that means that would symbol the event. So it's supposed to be a shit show. But, lean into it, get the professional help. We've given you Angel's information. You have my information. We will be posting additional mental health resources on the Objectiveness Legacy social media pages tomorrow. So follow us, and thank you for spending this hour with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank y'all so much, Shelley. It's so awesome as always. Angel, it was great to have you here. And if anyone wants to unmute now, you are welcome to say thank you. And otherwise, we're gonna head off.
All right, everybody, have a great day.
Thank you. This was super informative.
Nice meeting everyone. See you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We're going to close up in 3, 2, 1.